Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking literally the greatest, messiest land megadeal in all of history. You know, we usually think of national borders being drawn in blood and battle, right? But today's story is all about a transaction, a massive, continent-shifting transaction that was just completely unprecedented. $15 million. That is the massive price tag that doubled the nominal size of the United States back in 1803. Now, on paper, sure, it sounds like a totally straightforward real estate purchase, but behind that number hides an incredible, thrilling story. We're talking global warfare, super sketchy international financing, massive constitutional loopholes, and a staggering human cost that would echo for centuries. Part 1, the motivation to sell. Why Napoleon needed cash and Jefferson needed a port. To even understand how this monumental deal happened, we really have to look at the incredibly volatile real estate market of the late 18th century. This territory was essentially a giant game of geopolitical hot potato. France originally controlled it, but then they secretly handed it off to Spain in 1762. Fast forward to 1800, and Napoleon Bonaparte secretly gets it back. So this land was changing hands in the shadows long before the U.S. ever made a formal offer. And honestly, this made the American leadership incredibly nervous about having a powerful French empire popping up right in their backyard. The competing motives here were just night and day. President Thomas Jefferson was absolutely desperate for the Port of New Orleans. Without it, Western American farmers simply couldn't ship their agricultural goods down the Mississippi River. They needed it to survive economically. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Napoleon's grand vision for a North American empire had totally collapsed. He'd faced a fierce rebellion in Saint-Domingue, which is present-day Haiti, and that, along with disease, had completely decimated his troops. Facing an imminent, expensive war with Britain, Napoleon realized Louisiana was totally useless to him without his Caribbean stronghold. Simply put, he didn't need land anymore. He needed cash, fast. Part 2. Striking the noble bargain. How we went from a single port to half a continent. So Jefferson sends his envoys, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, over to Paris. And they had a very specific budget. They were authorized to spend up to $10 million, and that was just to buy New Orleans and its immediate surroundings. But they walked into the shock of a lifetime. Napoleon's team completely flipped the script on them. The French Treasury Minister offered to sell not just the port, but the entire Louisiana territory, the whole shebang. All 828,000 square miles for $15 million. If you do the math, that breaks down to less than 3 cents an acre. 3 cents. The American reps were just absolutely dumbfounded. They had zero authorization from Jefferson to go buy half a continent, but they weren't crazy. They knew they could not let a deal like this slip away. So they signed the treaty on April 30, 1803. In that exact moment, the negotiators were completely swept up in the romance of what they had just pulled off. Robert Livingston firmly believed they had secured America's future right then and there, saying it was the noblest work of their lives and that it elevated the young nation to a global power. But while they were popping champagne in Paris, a massive political storm was already brewing back in Washington. Part 3. The Constitutional Crisis. Basically, breaking the rules to buy the land. Bringing this megadeal home triggered a huge domestic backlash. And the irony here is just so thick, especially for President Jefferson. He was famously known as a strict constructionist, meaning he firmly believed the federal government could only do exactly what was explicitly written down in the law. No exceptions. But here's the catch. The Constitution actually said absolutely nothing about a president's power to purchase new territory from foreign powers. Nothing. Jefferson's whole political philosophy was put to the ultimate test. His cabinet literally had to talk him out of pushing for a constitutional amendment, warning him that Napoleon might get cold feet and withdraw the offer while they waited. To get past this, Jefferson had to do some serious mental gymnastics to justify his hypocrisy. He ended up comparing himself to a guardian doing what was best for a ward. He essentially rationalized that expanding the country was ultimately for the protection and the greater good of the citizens, which, in his mind, made bypassing his own strict rules totally acceptable. Oh, but the opposition pounced. The Federalists were strongly opposed to the purchase. They were horrified by the outrageous cost, and they were terrified that these new Western states would be heavily agricultural, which would completely dilute the political and economic power of the merchants and bankers up in New England. The outrage got so severe that a group of Northern Federalists, led by Senator Timothy Pickering of Massachusetts, actually explored forming a completely separate Northern Confederacy to break away entirely.
I mean, a motion in the House to deny funding for the whole purchase failed by a razor-thin margin of just 2 votes. 2 votes! Moving on to Part 4, Financing the Mega Deal, or How a Broke Nation Actually Pays an Emperor. Despite all that intense political drama, Congress did narrowly approve the treaty. But that created a brand new, very practical problem. The fledgling U.S. government didn't exactly have $15 million just sitting in a bank somewhere. They had to use some incredibly creative financing to pull this off. Out of the $15 million, $3.75 million was actually handled by the U.S., just assuming debts that France already owed to American citizens. To cover the remaining $11.25 million, the government had to issue massive 6% bonds. And this is where the story gets absolutely wild. To get Napoleon his cash quickly, the U.S. turned to Baring and Company of London and Hope and Company of Amsterdam to underwrite and purchase those bonds. Think about that for a second. The ultimate irony of this whole mega deal is that the U.S. used British and Dutch banks to finance the transaction, literally handing Napoleon the millions in hard cash he needed to turn around and immediately launch a massive war against Britain. You really can't make this stuff up. Finally, Part 5, the fine print and the human cost. Let's look at the dark reality of this real estate. We've talked a lot about the politics and the money, but we really must examine the dark underbelly of this transaction. Because the truth is, the U.S. didn't actually buy a massive tract of empty land from France. Not even close. In reality, France only physically controlled a tiny, tiny fraction of the area they supposedly sold. The vast majority of that territory was inhabited and controlled by Native Americans. What the U.S. actually purchased from Napoleon for $15 million was simply a preemptive right. This was essentially a monopoly right, recognized by other European powers, to take the land from Native Americans, either by treaty or by outright conquest, without any interference from other colonizers. And we also have to look at how this huge acquisition escalated the tragedy of slavery in America. The territory already had a really complex demographic, which included planters who had fled that Saint-Domingue Revolution, and they brought enslaved people with them. As the U.S. took over, Southern slaveholders pushed hard to ensure slavery was legalized and fiercely protected in these new lands, so they could expand their agricultural enterprises out west. This relentless push directly set the stage for intense sectional conflicts, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, completely laying the groundwork for the American Civil War just a half-century later. On top of that, the purchase ushered in a horrific era of devastating displacement for indigenous peoples, ultimately culminating in tragic events like the Trail of Tears. As Interior Department lawyer Felix S. Cohen pointed out much later, the real estate wasn't truly bought from Napoleon at all. That $15 million to France, it was essentially just a down payment for a century of displacement, conquest, and subsequent court battles with the true original owners. When you look at the true financial and human cost over time, the scale is just staggering. While the history books love to focus on that original $15 million paid to France back in 1803, the U.S. government ultimately paid an estimated $2.6 billion to Native American tribes in subsequent treaties and damages up to the year 2012 for this exact same land. That payment to France was only a microscopic fraction of the ultimate cost. So when you strip away the romanticized history of brilliant diplomats securing a noble bargain, and you examine the super sketchy financing, the constitutional gymnastics, and the sheer scale of the displacement and the wars that followed, it leaves us with one haunting question. If $15 million only bought the right to conquer, who truly paid the price for America's greatest mega deal? The map changed overnight for sure, but the true toll of the Louisiana Purchase took centuries to unfold. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope this permanently changes how you view the map of the United States. Catch you next time.